Okay, today we're looking at balancing equations. I'm going to do a couple of these, one pretty simple and one a little bit more complicated. So I'll start with the first one, which is the synthesis of water. So I already have my chemical equation written here. Again, the first thing I want to recognize is that this is not consistent with the law of conservation of matter, which is why we balance equations. The law of conservation of matter, or mass, says that matter cannot be created or destroyed. And if I look at this equation, I have two hydrogen atoms over here in the reactants. I have two oxygen atoms in the reactants. But in the products, I have two hydrogen atoms, but only one oxygen atom. So in this reaction, one of these oxygen atoms has just disappeared. And that's not consistent with the law of conservation of matter. I want to make my equation consistent with the law of conservation of matter. So that the same number of atoms that start over here in the reactants end up over here in the products. And that's why we balance equations, to make it consistent with the law of conservation of matter. So the first thing we're going to do is make a list. So I'm going to make a list of atoms of each element in the reactants and in the product. So my reactants are my hydrogen gas and my oxygen gas. My product is the water. So these are reactants, and these are products. I want to make my lists in the same order, and that just helps me to be able to compare my two lists and make sure that they are the same. So if I look over here, this 2 tells me that there's 2 hydrogen atoms. And over here, this tells me that there's 2 oxygen atoms. Now looking at the products, there's 2 hydrogen atoms. Look out. 2 hydrogen atoms and only 1 oxygen atom. All right, so now I can see that it's not balanced, and now I want to balance it. So I'm going to add coefficients in front of my compounds. That's what these blank lines are for, to add coefficients. And you can assume that each one of these has a coefficient of 1. We're not going to write coefficients of 1, but you can assume that there's a coefficient in 1 in front of each of these formulas. So I'm going to pick one element at a time. So in this case, the only element that's not balanced is oxygen. And I want to balance it out from the reactants and products. So the reactant has 2 oxygens. The product only has 1. So I'm going to add a coefficient in front of water in the product. And as soon as I do that, I want to cross out my tallies for anything that this coefficient applies to. So this coefficient is affecting the count for hydrogen, and it's affecting the count for oxygen. And I'm going to recount. So now there are 4 hydrogen atoms and 2 oxygen atoms. So I have succeeded in balancing out my oxygen. But in the process, I see that I have now unbalanced my hydrogen atoms. Now the next thing I have to do is balance hydrogen. So I have 4 in the products and only 2 in the reactant. So I'll add a coefficient of 2 in front of hydrogen so that there are 4. So now I'll cross that out. This coefficient only applies to hydrogen separated by this plus symbol. So oxygen is not affected, so I'm not going to cross that out. Now I have 2 times 2, which is 4 hydrogen atoms. And it is now balanced.